So good morning. So Ulrich has kind of set the stage for what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a few things particularly related to teacher quality that we think may be driving some of this inefficiency in how we spend our school dollars. So there's a few buckets that I want us to look at in terms of the problem. You know, you're all aware that there are budget cuts, there's fiscal pressure. How is that manifesting itself? Well, you know, one issue is that we've seen there's this historical focus in American schools on quantity over quality. Class size reduction, we've added a number of paraprofessionals, reading coaches, other folks. When we've confronted this problem of low achievement, mostly our response has been to throw bodies at the problem and not to be thoughtful about ways to solve the issue with the resources we have in place. We have a lot of mandates. Ulrich has described a few of them on school districts and school boards that come from the state level and the federal level. So you don't just get a basket of dollars and figure out how to spend those most efficiently. You get a dozen baskets of dollars. In California, actually, I think there's close to 100 categorical programs at the state level. So these tie up school leaders in knots, which is a very serious issue. And finally, we have employee benefits in education that don't necessarily serve a 21st century workforce. So I want to talk about the challenges there. And the role that you as state legislators can play is to promote local accountability and sort of treating teachers and other workers in education as individuals rather than as sort of buckets of people. To cut red tape and to really take a hard look at employee benefits and see if the benefits in your state are really aligned with the outcomes that you want to achieve. So first, to look at some very high-level data. The education dollar in America is largely spent on people. So you see here the dark blue is the percentage of education spending in this country that goes towards salaries. Light blue is benefits, and green is everything else. So more than 80 cents of every dollar that we spend on education goes towards people. This shouldn't be that surprising. And this is operating budgets, I should mention, so this doesn't include construction. But you know, that shouldn't be all that surprising. It's a labor-intensive business to deliver instruction. But it's something that we have to be aware of, especially in an environment where we're cutting budgets. So we've seen a lot of districts around the country that have cut transportation budgets, that have cut back on the number of photocopies that teachers can make. This is a really, I'll be very frank, a very stupid way to cut budgets. If you have a fantastic high-performing teacher in a classroom, you're paying them a lot of money or a little bit of money, depending on where they are on the salary scale, to be in that classroom, and you tell them that they can't make photocopies because that budget has been cut, you're really not going about this in a smart way. So it's important to keep in mind that the K-12 budget is really people more than anything else. And people are expensive. So this is per pupil spending from 1970 to 2008, and this is in constant dollars. This is in 2008 dollars. So spending over the last 40 years has more than doubled in real terms. So the question is, why is that happening? Is it because we're now paying teachers a whole lot more money, or is it because we've hired a whole lot more people? Well, it's the latter, for sure. So this is the student-teacher ratio over that same period. It's gone from about 22.5 to 15. And this is just teachers. So just on the actual classroom teacher side, we have staffed up dramatically over the last 40 years. This doesn't even get into non-teaching personnel, reading coaches, special education coordinators, administrators, compliance people. So we've added a lot of bodies to the system. Are we paying teachers a lot more? Not at all. So this is again in real terms, same period. Teacher salaries have gone up about 10% in real terms. So let's put those two pieces together again. Spending has doubled in real terms. Salaries have gone up 10%. And you know, the average doesn't look that bad, especially for those of you who live in lower cost jurisdictions. I grew up in Southern Illinois. I know we have some folks from Idaho in the audience. 55 grand probably doesn't sound that bad for an average salary. But obviously this is an average, so this takes into account New York City, DC, Los Angeles, and starting salaries are really not great. So in California, the average starting salary for a teacher is about $41,000. In Texas, the average is $33,000. In Montana, the average is $25,000 for a starting teacher. So when you're talking about trying to attract really high-quality talent to teaching, we're not getting the job done. So why? And another look at quality, sorry. So the average SAT score for kids who are entering education schools this past fall 1443. For those of you who took the SAT before the huge changes that happened in the mid-2000s, I mean, this doesn't look too bad. My SAT score was just a little bit above this, but it's now on a 2,400-point scale, not a 1,600-point scale. So the average for all takers of the SAT, and this is juniors who are doing a practice run, this is kids who didn't even get into their local state school, this is everybody, the entire pool was 1,500. So we have a workforce, an entering workforce, the quality of which, at least by the SAT and by some other factors, there's research on other factors, is dramatically below average. And I'm going to see class size reduction as one of the culprits here. There's a Brookings study that was done about a year ago looking at California's class size reduction policies. This is a very popular policy. Parents love small class sizes. It's a very easy way to do something that you think is going to be effective. The research shows at large scale it's actually not effective. Why? Well, in California, in the first 2 years of the policy, 25,000 new teacher positions were created. So think about that in terms of a labor market perspective. This year, you're hiring 25,000 people who last year were not good enough to get a job, right? So you've got to think about what that does to quality. That's serious. And in California, the result was a lot of those positions were filled by people who were not experienced, were not prepared to be teachers. Yeah?
I'm not sure if this is true nationwide, but I was kind of discouraged to learn that in Arizona, in the teaching college, like at ASU as a teaching college, that the courses are like watered down. That the chemistry instructor is not taking regular chem courses. They're taking like chemistry. Is that true nationwide?
Yeah, this is actually a really good point, and it is true nationwide. So the National Center on Teacher Quality, which Fordham was involved in getting started earlier in the 2000s, is doing a comprehensive look at the quality of education schools around the country, and the picture is just really not good. So to your point about science teachers, STEM or science, technology, engineering, and math is a huge focus area for the country right now, trying to make the United States more competitive. An example that I'm most familiar with is actually Texas. In Texas, schools want to hire teachers, science teachers, who are kind of utility players. Maybe they wanted to major in chemistry in college, but they need to be able to teach some physics and some biology too. And so education schools, they're not requiring people to become, really expert chemists. They're requiring people to become science teachers, which is not the same thing. And because of some factors I'm going to get into in a little bit, it's also not really possible to compensate science teachers in a way that you can really pay a fantastic chemist a lot of money to come teach for you and figure out ways in your budget to make that happen. So quality is not great. So the recommendations here, there's a number of things that state legislators can do in a really immediate way to make the picture better. So in many states, when you do a layoff, it's mandated by state law that it has to be done by seniority, last in, first out. So you have a fantastic third or fourth year teacher that you've invested a lot of time and money in who's gotten really good at their craft. The research shows that teachers get up to speed or don't over the first 5 years. So a fantastic teacher is a fantastic teacher in year 5 and for the rest of their career. They're gone, and the 30-year teacher who was not very effective is kept, and it's state law that mandates that. It may be the case that in a given school district, it's really the wrong thing to do to fire that 30-year teacher. Let the school board, let the principal, let the superintendent make that decision, not state law. So if you can get state law out of this, that would be fantastic. Back to class size. There are state-level class size mandates in a lot of states. California, Florida has a class size mandate and it was actually brought to referendum and failed to roll that back. These are just not good policies. The research that shows class size reduction works is in early grades and in very, very small experiments. When you try to reduce class size across an entire state, teacher quality suffers in a way that makes the whole experiment ineffective, and it's very, very expensive. And finally, on this teacher quality point, give districts the freedom to set salaries. So there are a number of states where the salary schedule is set at the state level and districts can't deviate from it. That's not healthy, especially as we're talking about incentivizing science teachers, incentivizing other hard-to-staff positions, incentivizing fantastic teachers to teach in high-poverty urban schools where teachers don't necessarily want to teach. If you have state-level salary schedules, superintendents' hands are tied to try to pay those folks more to keep them. This is the way labor markets work. If it's hard to staff a position, you have to pay that person more. Not in public education, by and large. So that's a very serious concern.
One question.
Yeah.
When you say state law, is that collective bargaining?
No, these are two separate things. Although collective bargaining certainly is important, but the state of Ohio is a good example. There's a state-level salary schedule in Ohio, and it's certainly in part a byproduct of union lobbying. So unions are involved in that. And I want to say, I don't want to hammer on teacher unions. I'm from a right-of-center think tank, so that might be the role that I might be expected to play. I mean, these are organizations that are doing their job and need to advocate for their members. So I don't at all question that.
I was referencing in the first in, first out. Isn't that more of collective bargaining?
Again, that varies. There are states where that's mandated by state law. Ohio just rolled that back recently.
But then there are a lot of districts in which then that is a part of collective bargaining.
Right.
That was set then at the district level. But then in some, see, the growth happened such that it then became part of state law and it wouldn't necessarily be a part of collective bargaining per se.
Right. I mean, it is a good point, though. You know, if you as state legislators roll this back at the state level, that means you've got to get some courageous school board members who are actually going to push for this at the local level. Otherwise, it doesn't get done. But give those localities the opportunity to be courageous. It's certainly happening around the country. It's in places. So moving on to the next section that I wanted to talk about is benefits. So this, I think, is one of the scariest graphs in all of public education, really in government, period, state government. State retirement systems are drastically underfunded. So the graph on the left, the bar on the left, is state pension plans for public sector workers, not just teachers. States have saved some against these liabilities, but there's a $600 billion hole. $600 billion in underfunding. So that's material and that's scary. The graph on the right is a little less known and a little bit of a sleeper problem, which is retiree health care. In a lot of states, public sector workers get their health care entirely paid for or substantially paid for in retirement. And states had not banked much money against this. Actually, if you look at the graph, it looks like they've banked nothing. There's a tiny little bar at the bottom, which is $30 billion against a $630 billion liability. So you're talking about a $1.2 trillion hole in state finances. And this, I should add, is based on really rosy investment assumptions. So before their reform, I think the state of Rhode Island was assuming an 8.75% investment return. California assumes like an 8.5% investment return. So this is really rosier than the real picture. There are a few folks who benefit in really serious ways from these systems, though. This is the $100,000 club in CalSTRS, the California Teacher Pension System. And during the depths of the financial crisis, the number of people receiving $100,000 a year pensions from CalSTRS nearly doubled in 2 years. So these are really expensive systems. It's important to point out, though, this is just a lucky few. Not everybody benefits from this. In fact, new teachers around the country are getting hammered, and these pension systems, which are very attractive for teachers who stay in the same system and teach an entire career, are making teaching really, really, really unattractive for new workers. So here's a case in point, Illinois. I grew up in Illinois. My dad is a retired firefighter here. My mother-in-law is a soon-to-retire teacher in Illinois. I know the human cost of these issues of having the shared sacrifice going on. This is the reform that Illinois did in 2010. If you've got two teachers, one of whom was hired on the last day of 2010 and one of whom was hired on the first day of 2011, this is the pension wealth that they're going to accrue over their career, net of their own contributions. So the teacher hired at the very end of 2010 is going to hit peak pension wealth earlier, and it's going to be over $500,000 in wealth. The teacher who was hired on the first day of 2011 is going to take about 5 years longer to hit peak pension wealth, and it's going to be just over $200K. This is what we're doing in a lot of systems around the country is you kind of nibble around the edges of the problem. You raise contributions, you slightly cut benefits. You don't meaningfully reform the retirement system. You just do the same thing on a slightly lesser scale. And state laws or state court judgments often require that you totally hold harmless people who are already in the system, so the net result is you just hammer on new teachers. This does not make teaching an attractive profession. You already saw the salary numbers. The pension numbers don't look good either. And to get any benefit, you've got to really stay in the same system your whole career. So this graph shows a teacher who teaches in Missouri their entire career. That's the top line. And the bottom line is a teacher who teaches in Missouri for half their career and then leaves for another state which is exactly identical to Missouri. So there's no differences in assumptions about how the system works. It's just Missouri A and Missouri B, right? They lose an enormous amount of pension wealth by moving from one state to the next midway through their career, an enormous amount of wealth. So when you think about a workforce which is increasingly mobile and which doesn't necessarily, folks my age don't necessarily expect to spend their entire careers in one profession. I've been a management consultant in hospitality and now a nonprofit CFO. I've lived and worked in Illinois, North Carolina, and the DC area. That's what the workforce looks like right now. The benefits we have set up punishes people who are part of that workforce and who need mobility. So these benefits don't necessarily serve the kind of folks that we want to attract to teaching. So this is a really hard thing to reform. I'll say that straight out, right? Like reforming pensions is incredibly hard legally and politically. It's not impossible, though. These are two folks who are smiling about the reforms that they've done. The woman on the left is Gina Raimondo, who's the Democratic state treasurer in Rhode Island. You see her $4 billion smile there. She has saved taxpayers a lot of money and saved a system that was in serious, serious crisis. Rhode Island had one of the worst pension systems in the country before they did their reform. And she did it as a Democrat. The guy on the right is Dan Lillenquist, who was a state senator in the state of Utah, is now running against Orrin Hatch for U.S. Senate in the Republican primary there. Utah's system was not in crisis. I think this is one of the most interesting stories that came out of the recession. Dan saw a hole in the Utah system. The Utah system suffered as all pension systems did during the financial crisis. Wasn't in such serious crisis that it couldn't be fixed, but he saw that if there were another crisis like the one they had just suffered, Utah taxpayers could be in serious trouble and teachers in Utah could be in serious trouble. And so he pushed very hard to build a political coalition, admittedly in a very red state, to move toward a hybrid system that took some risk out of the system for taxpayers and that created a system that's more sustainable for teachers. So the point of this slide is just that reform is possible. You've got to figure out what the right conditions are in your state, but I think the problem is serious enough, both in terms of the financial sustainability of these benefit programs and in terms of the incentives they present to 21st century workforce, that you got to do something. So the recommendation is really just to look at how you could reform this in your state to get a sustainable and portable system, to pay down whatever hole you might have in your state, and to figure out how to fix health benefits for retirees so that they're sustainable. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to move away from a traditional defined benefit system to a 401k-like system, although I think that's a good move. Ulrich's colleague Reagan Miller at the Center for American Progress did a paper looking at some of this stuff as well, and I know Reagan's favorite reform is to do what's called a cash balance plan, which looks a lot like a traditional defined benefit plan, but it's more portable, and you accrue pension wealth over time based on your salary and not based on these crazy peaks and valleys, so that once you are close to retirement, you earn multiples of your salary every year in pension wealth. So there's ways that you can reform this that don't necessarily look like moving towards a corporate-style 401k system, although I think that's a good idea. So the upshot here is, don't let a crisis go to waste. I use Rahm Emanuel's favorite quote. These problems were in our education system, have been in our education system for a very long time. The crisis just brought them to light. So I think we've entered this sort of new normal of flat education funding. We have built-in cost escalators from salary schedules that keep going up, benefit costs that keep going up. So this pressure is going to continue, and I think it behooves us not to ignore the problems that the crisis has brought to light. There are examples of how to do this, and to do this in a way that's politically feasible and that is sustainable and that improves the education system for a lot of constituents, for taxpayers, for teachers, for parents, for kids. There are examples out there. So I think despite showing you a whole bunch of really dire graphs, I think the future can look bright if folks step up and make reforms that are meaningful and that have outcomes for kids as the first goal. So that's it for me. Thank you.